Hey everybody, welcome back. Alright, so now we have our pad sound. Let's look at how we came up with the melody from scratch. Now it may help some of you to know that I actually don't play any instruments and I am self-taught when it comes to music theory. And it's important that you understand that even if you have very little music theory knowledge, you can still create seemingly complex and beautiful chord progressions and melodies. The way to do this is to create complexity out of simplicity. This is a concept that can be applied to many things in music production, but obviously we'll talk in terms of the chord progression here. And all it means is we start off simply with triad chords, which are the most basic 3-note chords, and then we start experimenting with different voicings and try different chord types, etc. Doing this with just a basic bit of understanding, you can come up with some pretty awesome chord progressions. Now, I don't want to preach to the choir here, so any of you that already understand the basics of scales and know how to make triads can skip on to the next lesson where we actually start building the melody from the ground up. For people who are new to music theory or want a quick refresh, I'm going to cover the absolute basics so you can understand what is going on in the next lesson and also so you can do this in your own tracks. So the best way to approach this is to break it down into steps. So step 1 is to pick the scale that you want to use. For this track, we use the C minor scale. In your tracks, obviously, you can use any scale you like. The same rules apply to making triads and chord progressions. It's just the scale gives you the basic musical framework that you need to get started. So step 2 is to find out what notes in that scale. Now, your DAW might actually have tools built in for this, like Cubase does, but the easy thing to do is just Google notes in the C minor scale. Hit enter and then go to images. And what you want to look for is these images from basicmusictheory.com. They're like the easiest to understand, but you might prefer others. It depends sort of what your musical background is. And straight away, I can see that in the C minor scale, we have C, D, E flat, F, G, A flat, B flat, and then obviously back to C. And that just repeats. Now, what I recommend that you do is then transfer these notes to your DAW so you can easily reference them. So I'm just going to move my pad out of the way and I'll just draw in a blank MIDI segment, go into it. And what I mean to reference them is we'll just like literally draw in the notes. Just make this a bit more zoomed in. So we've got C, which is obviously the tonic of our scale, D, E flat, F, G, A flat, B flat, and then it repeats going back to C and it starts all over again. But that's enough. We just got all the notes in there as reference. So these are the notes that we can use to make our chord progression and or melody. Just so you know, a quick one, because obviously I said we got E flat, we got A flat and B flat. Now, it's a little bit confusing in most DAWs because what is actually E flat in some scales is also known as D sharp in others. And most DAWs, maybe your DAW is slightly different, but in Cubase, it's always labeled as D sharp, even though it's actually E flat. A little bit confusing, but really it's not that important in the grand scheme of things. You don't need to like actually understand that to be able to use the tricks that I'm going to show you to be able to like make chords and stuff. All right, so with that out the way, let's actually look at making triads. So making triads is like the easiest thing in the world. Trust me, anybody can do this. So you start with the root note. So in this case, I'm just going to draw a chord in on C because that's our scale. So we'll start with that, but we'll progress on to different chords. Let's just give myself a little more room here. So once you've got your root note in, which is C, in this case, you then skip a note in the scale, which is D, and then draw a note in on the next note in the scale, which is E flat. Then you do the same thing. You skip another note in the scale, and then you draw a note in on the next note in the scale. And that's literally it. And it applies on any note in the scale. So for example, if I want an E flat chord, so I draw in the root note, so go on E flat, then I miss a note in the scale and then draw in a note. And then I do the same, I miss a note in the scale and I draw in another note. Like I say, this works on any note in the scale. It's as simple as that. And then you start to see how important it is to pick the scale. It doesn't matter what scale you're in, it will still, the same rules apply. And once you know that, you can literally make any chord you want. So let's, for example, just do one more, and that is, say I want a B flat chord. So I can draw in my root note, Now I know I haven't got the notes drawn in there, but obviously it just continues up. So these literally just repeat. So it'd be like C, D, E flat, etc. So I can just sort of use the notes I've already got. So I've got my B flat. I miss a note in the scale. So the next note will be D. And then I miss a note in the scale. And the next note will be F. All right, so it's just like that. And there we go. We've got a little chord progression. So that's just an example. Of course, we're not actually going to use this one. We're going to use a different one in the next lesson, but we'll get to that. Now, the last thing I want to talk about here is the numbering of the chords, because it just makes it a bit easier. And it's very, very simple. So it's literally like you have numbers next to each of these and you just count up. So the tonic of the scale, C in this case, is always the 1 chord, and then the 2 chord, a 3 chord, 4 chord, 5 chord, 6 chord, 7 chord. It's literally that simple. So if I say I want a 2 chord, then you know that you go 1, 2, and then that will be the root note of the 2 chord. And then obviously you just follow the same steps. So we skip a note in the scale, then add a note, which is F, and then skip a note and add a note, which is A flat. So this is the 2 chord, because this chord here is a 3 chord, because it's 1, 2, 3, and then the root note of it starts in 3, this one up here. So obviously we count up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So that's the 7 chord. So if I say you want a 6 chord, pretty easy. Count up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and that's going to be the root note of the next triad that you make. So the last thing I will mention is that when it comes to choosing the chords that you use to make up your progression, 95% of the time you will start with the 1 chord as the first chord, just like this. It's quite rare that you actually start with a different chord. It can be done, but to be honest, when you're a beginner, just start with the 1 chord. It's going to make your life a lot easier. And then the last chord in the progression is 95% of the time. Again, always a 4 or a 5 chord. Okay, so that would be a chord starting with, in this particular scale anyway, it would be a chord starting with either F or G. So for example, let me just quickly do that. So I've got my F note, I skip a note, add a note, skip a note, add a note, which is obviously C. So the reason for this is that the transition from either the 4 or 5 chord at the end of the progression, going back to the 1 chord, gives a sort of sense of resolution. So we start with the 1 chord, and then end on the 4 chord. And that sort of transition always has a sense of resolution if you use the 4 or 5 chord. So basically, it's pretty simple to make a 4-bar chord progression, because you're always going to start with the 1 chord and you're always going to have a 4 or 5 chord at the end. And then you've just got to pick the 2 chords that go in between it that sound really nice, or how you want them to sound. All right, so I'm going to delete that because we're not going to be using it, but in the next lesson, we will get on with actually making the chord progression and showing you how I came up with it from scratch. So that is the foundational knowledge that you really need to understand in order to get started. Once you understand this, then you can add to that knowledge and start experimenting with things like 7 chords, sus chords, borrowed chords, which we're going to get to in the next lesson. All right, thank you very much for watching, guys and girls. I'll see you in the next one.